Welcome to Saturdays at 7, Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. My name is Todd Ream. I have the privilege of serving as the publisher for Christian Scholars Review and as the host for Saturdays at 7. I also have the privilege of serving on the faculty and the administration at Indiana Wesleyan University. Our guest is J. Bradley Creed, president of Campbell University. Thank you for joining us.
It's good to be here, Todd. Thank you for the invitation.
In June 1979, the 122nd session of the Southern Baptist Convention was held in Houston, Texas. And what occurred in that meeting is described, depending upon one's perspective, as either a takeover or a reform. Risking oversimplification on my part, I'll admit, conservative leaders were elected, replacing moderate leaders. And those conservative leaders were often identified as holding inerrantist or fundamentalist views of Scripture. Amongst educational institutions, changes imposed by the newly elected leadership initially impacted the seminaries, whose organizational connection was to the convention itself. College and universities were organizationally connected to their state conventions, but eventually those changes made their way to those institutions as well. As a church historian who graduated from college that same year, how would you describe the theological fabric of the college universities that shared relationships with their state conventions prior to and up to 1979?
The beginning of my graduate education started in 1979. And so I did 2 graduate degrees at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. There was never a time when the controversy was not prevalent and pervasive. It was the zeitgeist of the time. So you have correctly identified that the Southern Baptist Convention, a national entity, only owned and operated 6 seminaries, institutions of higher education. Baptists are a decentralized group. Sometimes people will act like bishops and tend to go in another direction, but technically there's a separation between the national level, state conventions, and local associations. Historically, the Baptist colleges across the South primarily had been related to the state conventions. Many of those colleges predated the formation of state conventions, but eventually came into alliance and some sort of governing a relationship. So that was the whole context for my graduate work. First did a master's in divinity and then the PhD, which I completed in 1986. It had an unsettling effect in the institution that I went to and others. Southwestern Seminary at that time was the largest. Being in Texas, things have to be bigger in Texas. But there were, over 4,000 students when I was there. I had larger classes in some cases at seminary than I did as an undergraduate at Baylor. I would say at that time, Southwestern was, I think, arguably one of the more conservative schools in theology, and it has to do with its history and its background. And so still, because of this orchestrated and concerted effort to, elect the president of the National Convention who had quite a bit of leeway in appointing certain committees, which could have an influence on the institutions, that happened over a protracted period of time, and it was undulating. It went from the beginning until whenever that group declared victory, but it was unsettling on many of the faculty and staff. So that colored everything while we were there. We didn't see a lot of divisions. You'd see some students taking sides one way or the other, but it wasn't as divisive among the students as it later became within the SBC itself, and even continues to be today after the so-called takeover or reformation was complete.
Yeah. Thank you. After watching the changes imposed by the newly elected leadership on seminaries, how then did colleges and universities respond over the following, say, 10 to 15 years?
That was more decentralized, and there's a more variety there because it all depended on what happened in the state conventions. But there was kind of a parallel and corresponding movement in the state conventions to replicate at the state level what was happening at the national level. and with varying degrees of success. And you could almost go state by state. Early on in 1992, the institution from which I graduated as an undergraduate, Baylor, and to which I returned for 8 years later to help found Truett Seminary. In 1992, Baylor made a very decisive, swift, and somewhat clandestine move to sever its ties from the Baptist General Convention of Texas. Baylor's contention was that it had been chartered by not the state of Texas, but the Republic of Texas, and that took precedent. And what ended up happening there was kind of a detente. And so the schools in Texas that are Baptist related still have some governing relationship. But I think at Baylor, for example, the state convention still elects or affirms 1/4 of Baylor's trustees. In other places, there was more of a takeover or control, like you saw at the national level. There were some schools early on that just opted out, and some of those Baptist schools, even before this controversy was full bore. I think of Wake Forest University that's here in North Carolina, Richmond University in Virginia, Meredith College in North Carolina, and somewhere along the way, Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. There were others that took measures to increase their autonomy and started making changes in their governance structure. It depended on the state. In North Carolina, the Baptist schools kind of came together. It was not without friction, but it was mostly amiable for what I've told. All schools that were still related to the state convention left at the same time, and that would have included Campbell, Chowan University, Gardner-Webb University, and Mars Hill College or University. Campbell defines in its official documents that we have an autonomous and voluntary relationship with the North Carolina Baptist Convention. We receive no money from them. They elect none of our trustees. But I've had a very amiable and working relationship with the state convention director, and we honor that part of our heritage. It hasn't always been that smooth in other places, but more and more schools received less and less money from the state conventions, whether they retain governing control or not. And that's what's happened in the last, 25 years or so at the state level.
Yeah. When you assess how a historically Baptist, Southern Baptist college or university expresses its Christian commitment today, where do you go to look for insights? What commitments and or practices do you believe are most important to observe and reflect what those commitments actually are?
Yeah, that's a very good question because, when you separate from the state convention, you lose some of that connective tissue, and you lose the culture of that. But the first place that I go to is the mission statement of the university, and that's very important here. I think you could read Campbell's mission statement, and it's clearly a Christian identity. There's biblical language there, but it also has other things that you would see at another university about learning and student life and so forth. I think you look at who the university hires, particularly at its senior administrative level. When I was hired here, I'm a Baptist by practice and by persuasion, but there was not a mandate to hire a Baptist as the president. And then I think who that chief executive officer in turn hires to be a part of the senior cabinet is important. You get down to hiring a faculty, and this is where the schools will often diverge. At Campbell, we hire according to mission, but we do not require all of our faculty to be confessing Christians or even Baptist. And I like to say we take a missional approach to our identity. I would describe other schools as taking a covenantal approach. And I think of, non-Baptist schools like Calvin College and Wheaton, very fine institutions that, have faith requirements and are a little more specific in hiring or in ways that we are not. And then you look at the curriculum, some, and I think that the ethos, and by that, I don't mean just kind of a sense of what's in the air, but the chapel place that it has, if worship services are taking place, if there are requirements in the curriculum that students, whatever their religious background is, that they would take about the Christian faith, whether it's an introduction to New Testament, Old Testament, or Christianity, prayer, which is common on our campus before we have meetings. some of the more behavioral sorts of things. We don't have men and women living on the same floors in the dorms, and we don't serve alcohol on campus. And those are the sorts of things that you look at. I think some schools, I look at a Calvin College because of their Reformed background and the sort of Kuyperian approach. You see it much more integrated into their curriculum. And I think in the Baptist schools, you will see evidence of it, but not so much as emphasis upon a Christian worldview and those sorts of things. But those are some of the touchstones and the benchmarks that I observe in looking at a school that's not my own, but that I have paid attention to while being president here for years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to ask you now about some further details about your own calling and how you come to understand it. You've already mentioned that you went to Baylor as an undergraduate and then did an MDiv and a PhD at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. You then also pastored churches in both Texas and Louisiana. Could you start by describing your call to the ministry?
I was very blessed to be raised in a Christian home. Baptists have no grandchildren. You have to make that decision for yourself. But I look back at my family, and a direct great-grandfather was Isaac Newton Langston, and he was an early Baptist leader in Alabama. I found all this out later, and his daughter married a Creed. And so I come from a long line of Baptist deacons. My mother was raised in the non-instrumental Church of Christ. And it's interesting, just as a sidelight here, I found out that my great-great-grandfather on my maternal side was Freeman Benjamin Dowd, who was the national leader of the Rosicrucian movement. Published, and we would consider that a cult. And so it's interesting from that. My mother, she had no awareness of that until recently, and I think she maybe would wish that we hadn't dug that deeply into our theology. But I had a Christian background. My mother eventually joined the Baptist Church. So the Central Baptist Church of Jacksonville, Texas was formative to me. And I had a youth minister in particular who was very helpful. But I just think about those dear lay people that gave of their time to teach me in Sunday school and royal ambassadors and all of that. And so I made a profession of faith when I was 11 and, never wavered from that. I don't have a salacious testimony about how I joined a biker gang or, did drugs or anything like that. I wanted to buy a motorcycle in high school when I was working and making my money, but my father said, "I don't care if it's your money, you're not going to have a motorcycle here." And in college at Baylor University, not knowing what I wanted to do in life, I thought about several things. I just had this growing sense, primarily through the ministry of a local church, that God was leading me into some kind of ministry. And so I was discerning with that call. I was prayerful about it. And probably toward the end of my sophomore year, made that a public decision. And there was never a time, though, when, education was always a part of that. I knew I wanted to pursue a PhD. So I've always had one foot in the academy and one in the church. So when I had been a full-time pastor, I taught adjunctively and would lecture at a state college where I was and did some academic writing. And when I've been in academia and administrative work, I've done a number of interim pastorates at various states. So that's been the context of my calling. And, if I got into this to be a teacher, I have failed because I've never been really a full-time faculty member. And you tend to go one or two directions in your journey. And I didn't set out to be a dean, or nobody in their right mind wants to be a provost, but I was out of my good mind for 14 years at a wonderful school, Samford, and, been a president for 10 years. I think I got into this because I like to learn, but these opportunities opened up for leadership, and I've taught along the way. I have a faculty appointment here, but I'm not tenured. And so I think the learning part is a part of my own spiritual development. I have always been a pursuer of the knowledge of God and the things of God, not that I understand that clearly or live by that. I'm still interested in the big questions that you often get through the liberal arts and the great books. What is reality? Is there a God? What does it mean to be a good person? What is the good life? What is community all about? And I think that's a part of our journey of being a follower of Christ. We read in the Old Testament about the knowledge of God and the wisdom of God, and then we hear about the mind of Christ. And I think that's at the heart of who I am. As you mentioned, or maybe it was before we started recording, I will be retiring at the end of this year.
Mhm.
And I was visiting with Daniel Elshire recently, who's been a friend for years, was the head of the Association of Theological Schools, and he's kind of semi-retired and about to retire completely. And we both talked about we have a chance to live out our faith not being professional Christians when we retire. And, the Apostle Paul said, for me to live is Christ. He didn't say for me to live is my ministry or my presidency or my tenured faculty position. And so I will go back to that time and time again. And that call to serve and to lead has been manifested in different ways, but that's been, I think, the center of who I am, working both in the academy and the church.
Thank you very much. You served for approximately 15 years as the dean of Truett Seminary at Baylor University.
Actually, it was closer. I was there a total of 8 years. That was one correction to the biography. There were times where it felt like 15 years. No, but I was there from before the beginning. I went as the associate dean when it was 2 people, a legal pad, and a pencil. And we did everything for 1 year, recruiting that first class, and took our first class in 1994. And I was asked to come back in August for the 30th anniversary of the beginning, and was absolutely overwhelmed. I had a speaking role, a surprising number of people who were there. It was a big deal. And the seminary is just doing well under its current leadership with Dean Todd Steele and the president of Baylor, Linda Livingstone, who was a colleague at Baylor. She was associate dean in the School of Education when I was there. And so I was there as a startup. I had started a new church planter at one time, and this was an academic startup, but in the context of a research university. And then after 8 years, went on to Samford.
Yeah. What lessons did you learn by serving as dean for such a young seminary, a startup? Arguably even still, but when you took the reins there, that you still carry with you perhaps to this day.
Well, I was very young, and I had a chance to go teach at Southwestern Seminary in 1992. And just because of the unrest and instability that was going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, I decided that was not a wise way to go. And then things opened up for me to go to Truett Seminary. And I was a very young dean. In fact, when I was an associate dean, I remember going to a meeting of all the associate deans on campus, and this officious woman, shooed me out of one room and told me that the meeting for the graduate students was down the hall. And with this head of gray hair, nobody makes that mistake anymore. But it was at Baylor a crucible for my leadership. It was a divisive time in denominational life, and it was a fermentive time at Baylor where there was a lot of conflict and skirmishes over the direction and the purpose of Baylor. But, I learned a lot of things for the first time there that forged me and have stayed with me. And, often talk about, what I'm looking for in a leader. I think the importance of character is essential in any leadership role. And so for the Christian, that goes back to maintaining your walk with Christ. And, the disciplines of the Spirit that you must go through. I read the Bible every day and pray, and I've taken retreats and worship and all those sorts of things. Along the way, you learn that in a leadership position, you're paid not just to be somebody, you're paid to do something. You have to accomplish things. And so leadership is a process of recruiting and mobilizing people and programs together toward a stated or shared goal and strategic priorities. And hopefully you can develop people in the process so that they discover their gifts. And you've got to get things done. You're held accountable for that. I think there's certain things a leader does that I could talk about, and who that leader is important. but a leader's presence and how the leader lives and exists within the organizational system is highly important. And it's almost counterintuitive sometimes because I use this analogy: institutions, though they might be bureaucratic and have org charts and are hierarchical, and you might look at that as an engineer might, they're very organic as well. I mean, all the way from family units to a church to a faith-based college or, any system. And so it's how you function in that system. You have to be a non-anxious presence. Your hair can't catch on fire anytime there's a crisis. And you have to manage your own anxiety. And I think I've learned to do that over a period of time. As a leader, you have to have some level of comfort in having difficult conversations with people. And so those are just a few things that, as I look back, I've learned and certainly haven't always practiced as well as I would like to, but I think are very important in the leadership process.
Yeah. Next role that you filled for a good portion of your career was as Samford's provost. And I believe that you mentioned that serving as a chief academic officer, no one does in their right mind, just previously. But it was nonetheless, you also echoed too shortly after that, something that you thoroughly enjoyed. Would you describe the discernment process that led you to make the transition from Baylor to Samford and then to that role as provost?
Yeah, I just got a call out of the blue one day in my office from, would you hold for Tom Courts, president of Samford University? And a lot of people have been around for a while, know about the Courts brothers. And I'd met his wife before, and he was a bit cryptic. By the way, Tom Courts looked like he came out of Central Casting to be a college president. And, said he'd heard about me and is always trying to tell people good things about Samford, wanted to fly to Dallas and meet me for dinner. And I thought he was looking at me for maybe some other position, but it led to the process where I would come there to be the provost. I had a year overlapping with the provost where I served as associate provost, and that worked very well. And I think the key to being a provost is twofold. It depends on the president you work with, and then also having good relations with the faculty. And, you can easily get caught between the expectations of those. I worked with Tom Courts until he retired, and then Andy Westmoreland, who had been at Ouachita Baptist, came to be the president, and worked with him for maybe 9 years total and had an excellent relationship with him. I was very blessed to have two good presidents to work with. And I felt like I worked fairly well with people, but you have to stay engaged with people, but some degree of separation. What I liked about being a provost was I could touch on the widest swath of what the university's about every day, which is the academic mission. And I enjoyed the different disciplines. And I knew nothing about pharmacy, but if I were interviewing a prospective pharmacy faculty member, I'd always ask them to tell me about your research. And they were using all these terms that I wasn't familiar with. I'd not had chemistry in college, but if they could tell me in 8 minutes with some enthusiasm and clarity about their research, I thought that was a pretty good indicator they would be good teachers. And that tended to bear out. And so Samford was just a really good place. And it's the heart of what a university is all about. And to be able to try to interact with the faith basis of that university and academics was a challenge, but also very rewarding.
In what ways then did the theological fabric of Samford change over the course of the time that you were there in Birmingham?
Other people might want to address that, but I think when I got there were questions among some about to what extent and how do we go about interacting with our Christian mission and identity. Samford was certainly making strides in becoming more academically prestigious, rising in the U.S. News rankings and some excellent faculty. And so one of my charges was to make sure we stayed engaged with that and not to do it in an overly prescriptive way, to alienate people, but to have some clarity about it. And so I worked with the deans on it and didn't get too much pushback, but faculty are those people who think otherwise. And so, I would listen to them and valued them, and respected them. And so I approach that it's an engaging conversation that we have over a long period of time about the things that matter most. I would describe that as a university beyond the bricks and the mortar and the curriculum and all the programs we have. So I tried to engage people in those conversations. I did some specific things. I gave attention to hiring, got the things together. We need to have sort of a one-page description of what Samford was all about, and then started bringing faculty and others around this idea of a faith-based university. The Lilly Endowment was very generous to us. My first couple of years there, we applied for, I think they were $2 million grants each, and we got those. I would have faculty reading groups, lectures, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I approached it, and was able to do that over 14 years. And that's a long time to be a provost. I think if you try something over 5 years, it's going to be more of a challenge at a faith-based university like Samford and like Campbell, where I am now. But that was my approach to it, and felt a sense of accomplishment in that by the time I left.
Thank you. I want to transition now to asking you about your presidency at Campbell. You came in 2015, so served 10 years essentially there as president. Can you start by talking about the discernment process that led you to embrace an appointment as a college president and as president at Campbell University?
Right. I think that last statement is the most important. I was looking back over some old journals the other day, and it was back in 2005 or 6. As I looked at my goals for the next year and my priorities, whenever I'd put college presidents, he was always with a question mark. So I couldn't tell you, like I think some people would tell you, my goal vocationally, professionally, is to be a university president. But I felt because of my experience and what I'd learned in my profile, to be a good steward of all that, I needed to be open to it. And probably about 2005, I met a certain profile. And so, a couple of times a year, I would get these entreaties and queries about, being a president, and interviewed a few times. There was one that I was told I was the second guy. Maybe they told everybody that, but the differentiator was that there was a sitting president they hired. I was actually relieved it didn't work out. There were a couple that wanted me to come, and I walked away from. And we had a terrible tragedy in our family. In 2007, our 19-year-old daughter, who was a student at Baylor, was killed in an automobile accident. And so there wasn't a time, to think about moving the family. But Andy Westmoreland and I talked, and, he talked about, we need to retire together. And I enjoyed working with Andy. So I was going to be content to kind of run out the tape, for the next however many 7 years that was or whatever. And then I get this call from a search consultant, and she just kept calling me back. She told me about another opportunity, and she was different than most search consultants. I had grown a bit jaundiced because you should never lose sight of the fact that the search consultant is not working for you. They're working for the university that's going to hire somebody. That's who's paying them. And I was content where I was. And so I let several deadlines pass for submitting materials and ignored it. And somewhere late that fall in October, she said, well, I think they're really interested in visiting with you. Would you at least send me a resume? And I did. And I think within 2 weeks, mid-November, I had the first an interview, and they moved pretty quickly towards me and voted me to be the 5th president of Campbell on January 2nd, 2015. Mm. And here's an amazing statistic about this place, not me. I'm only the 5th president here in 138 years. And wow. The first 2 were father and son, and the second 2 had worked together a long period of time. So there've really been 2 administrations in some ways. So I knew there was a lot of transition work, and they'd built on the great accomplishments of my predecessors. But there was a lot of modernizing and building up systems to support things. And and moving forward. So that's how it happened. And it was clear to me this was the next step that we were to take. And my wife, I think, who walks closer to God than I do, has always kind of known before I did that we were supposed to move. And so she was very supportive. And our youngest daughter had just decided she was going to go to Samford. We lived right behind the campus. After she told us, there's no way I'm going to Samford, because I work there. Made the decision to go. And within weeks, I had to pull her aside and say, I need to have a talk with you. You're going to get your college away experience because your parents are going off to another college. And she was a little bit sad about that at first, but she graduated from Samford and then moved out here to work and met the guy who's her husband and given me two beautiful grandsons. And so it's been a good move for us. And Campbell's just been a great place with wonderful people. And we've faced some enormous challenges like all schools have, compounded by COVID. But 10 years goes in a hurry, and I'll have the shortest tenure of the 5 presidents. But as you know, 10 years in the future is going to be a long tenure for a president.
I was going to say that's approaching twice as long as the average university president.
Exactly.
Right. So, yep. Thank you. When you came to Campbell, how would you describe the theological fabric of the institution? And in what ways has it changed, if at all, over the course of your 10 years as president?
I think regarding the sort of Christian mission and identity, I approached it similarly to what I did at Samford. I knew that I think the missional question is always the most important for any organization. And because the university had separated, I believe in 2008, from the state convention, there were some questions about what does this mean? I've never found the faculty here remonstrating real strongly one way or another. I mean, they support the mission here. For hiring and for promotion, we have 4 criteria. There's teaching, there's scholarship, there's service, and then support of mission. And I've already talked about how we don't require everyone to confess our faith. We'd like for them to do that, but they need to support our mission. We've even had non-Christian faculty members of other faiths that will talk about, I like how you integrate your faith here. We're finding that we're drawing more Hispanic students, many of whom are Catholics. We've got Muslim students and Hindu students. They like our values that in many ways are Christian values, but the dominant population of our students identify as Christians and still a good majority of those Baptists. So, doing some of the same things in hiring, but I felt like I was appreciated and supported, and it was welcome any of these kind of initiatives that we took with Lilly grants and public conversations we'd had. Pretty soon discovered that the university finances were not what anybody thought, and that's a separate story. And we really faced some pretty serious crises, and then COVID hit, and we were about to go through accreditation. So that's really what I've spent a lot of my time doing. Mm-hmm. And, we have better financial stability and management and reporting now. And so I wish that I could have given more time to that, but I had a supportive cabinet and a good faculty in our Christian studies program and in other areas. And so I don't see it as essentially different from what happened at Samford. It was similar in many ways.
In what ways did the university presidency itself, sort of writ large, change over the course of your tenure as president at Campbell? And in what ways, if any, did those changes then impact how you exercised your leadership?
Yeah. Well, I've been in leadership and executive positions for 32 years, which kind of astounds me. And I've said this publicly. I have seen more changes in higher education in the last 5 years than in the previous 25. COVID exacerbated that, but things were already brewing. People in universities know about the enrollment cliff, the demographic decline, just the public sentiment about college as a path to a good future has changed. We have political divisions in our country. which filter down. We're Division I athletics school, and if you're keeping up with the so-called settlement, the Alston case, NIL, name, image, likeness, that is bringing a tidal wave of changes, and so it makes it more difficult to be a president. In 2023, 2 years ago, the Chronicle of Higher Education issued a report, and it was called Trouble at the Top. And it was about the daunting challenges for today's college presidency. And one of my colleagues with whom I served on the board of the Council of Independent Colleges is quoted at the very beginning. And she says, "Welcome to hell. It's hot here, but this is my home and where I live." And the whole report talks about the challenges of the university presidency right now. The general public is familiar with campus protests this past year, mainly, over Israel and in Gaza and some of the highly publicized Senate hearings. We haven't faced anything like that at our university. We have a diverse student body, particularly for a school with our historical background and ties. But we haven't faced that, but we face a lot of the other challenges. And most of those boil down to finances, and a lot of private schools and even some public schools are under financial strain today. So those are some of the challenges. And I was hired here at age 58, and I represented the youth movement. And 10 years later, you can do the math on what age I will be. And I think 10 years is a good time if you stay 15, and many people have and done a great job. At that point, some people don't know otherwise. They become dependent on your style of leadership. I have a colleague, an incredible leader in his previous life that has become a university president last year, followed a man who was in the role more than 40 years. And I said, "Has that been difficult for you?" He said, "It hasn't been difficult for me, but it's been difficult for the people who worked so long, and many of them have had trouble adapting." So, as a president, you have to think about your own health and future and your interests, but you have to think about the well-being of the university. A lot of presidents left right after COVID, and it sure would have been tempting. It's like, we made it through that, but I wanted to stay, to the end of my contract and accomplish a few more things. And then, the last thing the leader says is, "Thank you. I plan to move out of the way," and you trust the rest to the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. As unfortunately our time begins to become short, I do want to ask you about the academic vocation, and the Christian academic vocation in particular, because you've served as a faculty member, a dean, an associate provost, and a president. And how have you come to understand the Christian academic vocation? And in particular, what qualities and or characteristics in your estimation define it?
There's so much that's been written on this. I think about what George Marsden has done. I think about Mark Knoll, and I think a lot of what they talk about would resonate. But for me, as I've told you already, I've had one foot in the academy and one in the church. And I think that's very important in an academic vocation in the Christian faith. I think for me, faith-seeking understanding has always been something that has motivated me. At university, you have to deal with all kinds of concepts and different modes of knowledge, and sometimes those conflict, and it brings dissonance with aspects of the faith. But I think that's all a part of what it's called about here. To me, though, I have to remember, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm still discerning this and trying to understand it. My calling is to Christ, and it wasn't to a particular position. The Campbell mission statement says that learning was appointed by God for human flourishing. And I think we would read scripture and that bears out. And I know historically, wherever Christians show up, some people would say pretty soon nobody's going to have a good time. That's kind of the old H.L. Mencken view, definition of a Puritan, But wherever Christians show up, schools and hospitals soon follow. Ministries of healing and ministries of learning in education. So the university, a faith-based university, is not the church, but it's adjunct to and works with the church. And that's how I understand that. And I think there's no domain of knowledge that we should not pursue. And the university is a convening place. We have challenging conversations. And that's often where we have some conflict with the members of our denominational bodies, who live by simple faith, which we honor. And, people warned me when I went off to college, don't study philosophy. I had a brother that did it and he lost his faith. And I still write my first philosophy professor, who's later dean at Baylor. He's in his 90s and sends me a Christmas card every year. And that class, when I was at Baylor, just opened up so many windows for me that made my faith stronger and my intellect stronger. And so it's a part of the journey. I went off on the route toward administration. And so there's some faculty would say, well, that's not an academic vocation. and I never have really taught much full time, but I have seen what I have done as being important and necessary to support the Christian Academy, and still will be a part of my consciousness as I move into the next phase of life.
Thank you. In that sense of support that you've offered then for the cultivation of faculty members and educators, what are the virtues that you thought were most important to seek to create the opportunities for development and formation?
I'll tell you how important it is here. Campbell University has done an incredible job of starting a lot of graduate programs. We have a medical school here. We've had a law school for 50 years. We've School of Engineering. And it was time for us to take a look at our undergraduate program. And so as I leave, we had the Campbell hallmarks: calling, initiative, and character. In fact, I just did a video about that recently. I do videos twice a month. And so character is going to be very important in this, in the curriculum and in mentoring. And we're thinking through all of that. And I tell students and I tell faculty as well, we want you to come here and follow your dreams and realize your goals. We want you to be successful, whatever it is you set your mind to do. This is a place where you can answer a calling. And we believe that God has created you to answer a call to do something that only you can do. We want you to be great. And I often add, and when you're successful, if that's financially so, please be generous to your alma mater. But then I always add, we want you to be great, but more importantly, we don't want you to be just great people. We want you to be good people. Mm-hmm. And the world needs more good people. I used to think character was an absolutely essential qualification for holding public office, but I don't think that's, a criterion anymore, sadly. When we talk about character here, we think about the classic virtues. When you study ethics in the disciplines, if it's journalistic ethics or medical ethics or business ethics, I think there's a place for that, but it's often about what you need to know so you don't mess up and get into trouble. Mm-hmm. This has to do with the formation of a person. And it's very consonant with our ideas of the Christian faith of growing in Christ and bearing the fruits of the Spirit and having the mind of Christ. We talk about courage and temperance and fortitude. And, I think we're talking about students being compassionate and, taking initiative, all those kinds of things that I won't be here to see bear fruit. We just got a grant to help us with this. But I think this is one thing that faith-based universities can do and do well and do in ways that other schools can't. And so it's an expression of our mission. You can do that in Indiana Wesleyan, and it becomes a marketing differentiator too. And I think with just what's happening in our country, not just at the public level of elected officials, but all across the board, we're going to need people of character, good people, because that's essential and had this moral compass. And so that's a part of our conversation here. And I think schools like ours have a place to shine and shine brightly going forward into the darkness.
Yep. Thank you. As we close our conversation today, I want to ask you to reflect back on your tenure as president. And in particular, what interactions with educators did you find most edifying? And what interactions did you find with students
Yeah.
most edifying?
Well, I did not have as many apparent or necessary interactions with educators as I did when I was a provost. So I made it a point to be out on campus. I'm a people person. We live on campus. I love the fishbowl. When I'm walking to my office, the students are going to class. But just, interacting with faculty, go around to school meetings. If there were events, public fora and things like that, where I might be a panelist with faculty members. And really, people like to talk about themselves. They want to know that you're interested in them. And this isn't just a Dale Carnegie gimmick on my part. I'm genuinely interested and curious about what people are doing and studying. And so I talk to them about their research or what they're teaching this semester. And that's the way that I come to their presentations. We do a lot with student research, those kind of things. The thing, though, that has been most rewarding to me here is the interaction with students. And, I can tell you, I'm pretty sure I know some things that I will not miss being a college president. And I do believe that I'm going to miss the students. And, I'm very visible. Our athletic director and I were just meeting. Our basketball team is doing well now. And we got a big game coming up. And I've offered to, camp out by the convocation center where we play overnight, waiting in line for tickets, like they do up at Duke. And so, I will miss those interactions. And Todd, this, we're in an interesting line of work, unlike any other profession, because a minister grows older with the members of her congregation and a doctor grows older with his patients. We get older every year and our students stay the same age. Really interesting perspective on life. And it's helped keep me young at heart. And I think that's been really enriching to me. I can speak only from the standpoint of our students. They have their struggles like anybody else. We know the statistics about the rise in mental health issues and all of that. But I'm really confident about the future when I look at our students. And I hope you would feel the same way about your students there. And I know people at Baylor and Samford would feel the same way. And that's why we're in this. I will have 6 or 7 graduation ceremonies I go through at the end of this semester. But if there's a high and holy moment in academia, it's the graduation ceremony. We wear special regalia and go through these rituals, but that's what it's all about. There's a sense of closure that you have with that you don't when you're a pastor of a church.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our guest has been J. Bradley Creed, president of Campbell University. Thank you for taking the time to join us and share your wisdom and insights with us today.
Thank you, Todd. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for Saturdays at 7. Christian Scholars Review's conversation series with thought leaders about the academic vocation and the relationship that vocation shares with the church. We invite you to join us again next week for Saturdays at 7.